Forget the thunder of heavy artillery. Forget the mechanical rattle of Maxim guns. In the First World War, the most terrifying sound wasn't an explosion. It was the frantic, wet rasp of a man's breathing in a dark trench. Minutes later, the silence would return. But the silence was heavy. It smelled of damp earth and iron. Generals promised a war of steel and industry. Instead, they got the trench raiders. These were men who traded long-range rifles for sharpened shovels and knives. By 1917, the industrial slaughter had devolved into primitive butchery. What drove modern soldiers back to the Stone Age? The answer lay in the failure of the Great Plan. In 1914, the French General Staff believed spirit was more important than concealment. They sent infantry into battle wearing bright red trousers. They viewed camouflage as an act of cowardice. While the generals obsessed over the color of cloth, the reality of the front was preparing a different lesson. By the third year of the conflict, the primary sound of war became the crunch of bone in the mud. The French High Command refused to change the uniform to preserve the offensive spirit. The year was 1871. Prussia crushed France. The humiliation didn't just hurt, it calcified into a dangerous blind faith. By 1914, European generals no longer studied maps, they studied willpower. The French High Command called it élan vital, the all-conquering spirit. They believed the sheer desire to win could shatter steel. Strategy became a secondary concern. Logic was traded for a secular religion of the offensive. Why send men into modern combat wearing neon-bright red trousers? The answer was simple. The General Staff viewed camouflage as a form of cowardice. To hide was to doubt. To blend in was to lose the fighting spirit. When reformers proposed a move to drab, invisible fabrics, the leadership revolted. They chose tradition over survival. In the summer of 1914, the French army marched toward German machine guns in bright red pants, because the High Command refused to trade glory for concealment. Engineers forged this suicidal philosophy into steel. They didn't build knives, they built spears for a war that no longer existed. The French Lebel Model 1886 was the standard. Its bayonet carried a 20-inch blade with an X-shaped cross-section. It was a needle designed to punch through heavy wool coats and bone. Attached to the rifle, the weapon reached 6 feet in length. Almost 2 meters of wood and iron. The average soldier stood 5'5". The rifle was taller than the man carrying it. German intelligence watched the French needle with respect. They countered with the Gewehr 98. 9 million of these rifles would eventually roll off assembly lines. Its bayonet stretched the total length to 5 feet 9 inches. Planners didn't design this for trenches. They designed it to unhorsed cavalrymen. They were training for the 19th century. Infantry practiced the thrust, the parry, and the lunge. They aimed for the throat, the breast, and the groin. The French practiced elbow-to-elbow formations. They believed massed human bodies could break modern fire. The German pioneers carried something different, the sawback bayonet. 29 double teeth ran along its spine. A soldier would draw the blade. He would press it against a thick branch or a wooden post. The metal would scream as the teeth bit into the grain. Sawdust fell into the mud. It was a tool for clearing brush and building gun positions. But Allied propaganda saw a monster. They called the serrated edge a tool of Germanic barbarism. In reality, the teeth were a liability. The blade got caught in the ribs and clothing of the enemy. It was useless in a frantic melee. Rumors spread through the ranks. Captured Germans with sawbacks were being executed on the spot. Panic hit the front lines. German soldiers began frantically grinding the teeth off their own blades against stones. In August 1914, theory met reality. French generals ignored the evolution of steel and cordite. They clung to the Napoleonic dream. French infantry marched toward Alsace-Lorraine as if on parade. Bright red trousers, deep blue coats. Regimental bands played while flags caught the wind. Officers led the way with drawn swords. It was a scene from a previous century. They marched directly into a meat grinder of industrial fire. August 22nd became the darkest date in the history of the French Republic. How much does a command failure cost? In August 1914, The price was 27,000 lives in a single day. 27,000 dead. The population of an entire city vanished in 24 hours. Machine guns and barbed wire turned the unstoppable bayonet charge into a suicide pact. The French never even reached stabbing distance. The Germans learned nothing from the slaughter. Crown Prince Wilhelm repeated the mistake on a massive scale during the Battle of the Marne. He ordered 100,000 soldiers to fix bayonets. They charged the French lines under the cover of night. It was a massacre in the dark. French 75mm guns fired point-blank into the gray masses. Chaos took over. German units lost their way and began shooting at each other in the confusion. Wilhelm's grand assault collapsed. 15,000 Germans fell for nothing. The war had reached a bloody stalemate. The Marne became a graveyard for 15,000 Germans, but the slaughter was only beginning. Strategy died, survival took its place. The race to the sea began as a chess match and ended as a burial rite. Each side tried to outflank the other, pushing further north, searching for an open door. But the doors were locked from above. For the first time, airplanes hovered over the battlefield. Aerial reconnaissance stripped away the element of surprise. Commanders saw every troop movement in real time. They watched the dust clouds of marching columns and simply moved their guns to meet them. The mechanics of the massacre were simple. Infantry charged across open fields. High explosive shells and machine-and-gewehr fire met them halfway. The math of the 19th century failed against the lead of the 20th. When the charge broke, the survivors didn't retreat. They couldn't. They dropped where they stood and clawed at the earth with fingernails and bayonets. A line of mud and blood soon stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. This was the West Front. 440 miles of unbroken fortifications. A revolution in firepower had arrived, but tactics remained frozen in the past. There were no more flanks to turn, no more maneuvers to execute. Every attack was now a frontal suicide mission into a wall of steel. By December, the cost of this tactical blindness was clear. 4 million men had been killed or wounded in just the first 5 months. To breach 440 miles of fortifications, the generals decided to replace men with steel. They looked at the trenches and saw a problem for engineers, not soldiers. The answer was simple: artillery. The theory was absolute. Days of constant shelling would shred the barbed wire. The earth would collapse. Every defender would be dead or broken. Why did the commanders order their men to walk across no man's land instead of charging? They believed not a single German would be left alive to pull a trigger. The Somme, July 1916. The British industry strained to its limit. They fired 1,500,000 shells in just 7 days. This was more steel than the entire British Empire produced in a year at the start of the war. But the earth had its own secrets. 40 feet below the surface, the Germans sat in reinforced concrete bunkers. The world above was screaming, but down there, the ground only trembled. A soldier could sit in the dark and drink coffee, while a hurricane of steel raked the soil 12 meters over his head. When the barrage stopped, the silence was the signal. The Germans scrambled up the shafts. They reached their Maxim guns before the first British boot hit the mud. Thousands of men walked into a wall of lead. They moved in perfect rows. Even a rare success was a trap. If a battalion captured a trench, they found 2 more lines behind it. The attackers were exhausted, bleeding, and alone. Then came the counterattack. Within 48 hours, the map looked exactly as it did before. The industrial slaughterhouse had failed. The generals realized that millions of shells could not clear the path for a single line of infantry. Tactics had to change, or the armies would simply vanish into the earth. Artillery drove men underground. But the earth didn't just hide them, it trapped them. Deep in the mud, war became personal again. The geometry of the front was a calculated nightmare. 7 feet deep, 6 feet wide, walls of wet clay topped with 3 feet of sandbags. Soon, this geometry will force soldiers to throw away their modern rifles. Why is a straight line a death sentence in the mud? Physics. A straight trench is a wind tunnel for shrapnel. One shell lands, and the blast wipes out an entire platoon. To survive, engineers built zigzags. They carved jagged bays into the soil. The Germans went deeper. They reinforced their walls with timber and concrete, reaching 12 feet down. It was stable. It was safe from shells. It was also a labyrinth. The senses narrow here. You smell raw earth and stagnant water. The walls press in. Because of those constant turns, a soldier can see no more than 30 feet. Modern warfare collided with the labyrinth. In a corridor 6 feet wide, the pride of 20th century industry became a liability. What do you do when your bayonet sinks into the enemy and stays there? Army engineers had spent decades perfecting bolt-action rifles for the open plains. They designed them for engagements at 300 yards. They tipped them with swords, blades 18 inches long. Now, soldiers carried 5 feet of wood and steel into a ditch where you couldn't even turn around. The weapon was too long. The space was too tight. It was a mechanical nightmare. The steel didn't just cut, it anchored. One Australian soldier watched a comrade lunging at a German. The bayonet pierced the chest. It kept going. The tip sank deep into a hardwood support beam behind the man. The soldier pulled. He braced his foot against the dying man's ribs and yanked. Nothing. The wood held the steel like a vice. Bone and grain fused together. To survive, the Australian had to unlock the latch and leave his rifle hanging from the corpse. Close quarters combat became a clumsy mutual execution. In the mud of no man's land, recovery teams found pairs of corpses. 2 men, 2 bayonets. Each had driven his blade into the other at the exact same microsecond. They died locked together. The sound was the worst part. The wet thud of steel hitting a torso. Then the metallic screech as the blade scraped against a rib or a wooden beam. Soldiers stopped trusting the factory manuals. A rifle designed for 300 yards was a death trap at arm's length. They needed something shorter, faster, and more brutal. They began to discard their long-reaching rifles. When modern tech failed, the soldiers reached into the dark memory of their ancestors. Evolution went into reverse. The bolt-action rifle was a sniper's dream, but in a hole 6 feet wide, it was a liability. The trench became a laboratory for murder. How did a simple tin can become a lethal weapon? Men took empty Mills bomb casings and fixed them to wooden handles. Others stripped the heads off entrenching tools, added lead weights, and drove hobnails into the wood. They created morning stars from the Middle Ages. Some even added flexible steel coils to the handles for extra striking power. One swing, one skull. The American Mark I trench knife took it further. It was a tool of pure tech analysis and brutality. The handle was a heavy brass knuckle duster. The base of the grip featured a pointed steel nub called a skull crusher. To ensure stealth, the entire weapon was chemically blackened. No glint in the moonlight. No warning. The spade, however, was the king of the pit. Soldiers threw away the bayonet and sharpened the edges of their shovels until they were razor sharp. A shovel has weight. It has balance. It doesn't get stuck in a rib cage like a pointed blade. One hack could sever a limb or split a helmet. The return to the medieval didn't stop at blades. It moved to armor. The Germans issued heavy steel breastplates, but they weighed over 20 pounds. They were useless for a charge. Only sentries and machine gunners wore them, standing like iron statues in the mud. The Americans attempted to go further with the Brewster body shield. It was a 40-pound suit of chrome nickel steel designed to stop a rifle round. It looked like a diving suit from a nightmare. During testing, it resisted direct hits, but the weight made movement impossible. The Brewster shield never saw a single day of combat. New weapons demanded a new way to kill. The Canadians perfected it. They turned the raid into surgical slaughter. Small teams crawled through the mud under the cover of a dead moon. They ignored the massive machine gun nests that erased entire battalions in daylight. Why cut miles of barbed wire? You only need one gap. Why overrun 1,000 yards of trench? You only need 10. Why attack when you don't intend to hold the ground? To spread terror, to steal secrets, to remind the enemy that even sleep is a gamble. They worked in the shadows. No artillery barrages gave them away. Surprise was their primary weapon. But luck was a thin shield. If the plan cracked, the raid became a tomb. The first true blueprint for this nightmare appeared on February 28, 1915. 100 men from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry slipped toward German lines near St. Eloi. They leveled 30 yards of enemy fortifications. It cost the Canadians 5 dead and 7 wounded. 2 men vanished into the dark. By November, the scale shifted. 170 volunteers gathered for a strike on Petit Douve Farm. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a rehearsal for murder. For 10 days, they scouted, they practiced, they stripped their uniforms of all insignia. If captured, they were nameless ghosts. At 2:30 in the morning on November 17th, the strike began. The German sentries were hiding from the freezing rain. They never saw the shadows moving. The efficiency was mechanical. In just 20 minutes, the Canadians killed 30 Germans. They dragged 12 prisoners back across no man's land. They carried new rubber gas masks for the intelligence officers to dissect. 30 dead Germans for 20 minutes of work. The Canadian loss was nearly zero. 1 man wounded, 1 man killed. The only fatality came from a stray bullet from his own side. But beneath the hunt for gas masks and intelligence lay a darker purpose. High Command viewed the front line with suspicion. On quiet sectors, a live and let live system had taken hold. Soldiers made deals. They stopped shelling latrines. They avoided firing during breakfast. In some areas, these informal truces reduced casualties by 40%. To the generals, this was a betrayal of the offensive spirit. How do you force men to kill those they have shared tea with? The answer was the raid. It wasn't about the ground, it was about blood. Officers used these night attacks to shatter the peace and force their men back into the cycle of hatred. Preparation began in the shadows of the dugout. A soldier held a wine cork over a candle. The smell of burnt cork filled the air. He smeared the black soot across his cheekbones and forehead. No skin could be left showing to reflect the moon. Next came the hands. He pulled on thick, heavy rubber gloves. They were designed for the wire. No snagging, no sound. Every piece of rattling gear was stripped away. No shiny buttons, no clinking canteens, no unit patches that could identify a corpse. The raider became a ghost made of grease and steel. The clock was the final commander. 20 minutes, that was the limit. After 20 minutes, the enemy would wake up and the reinforcements would arrive. The officer checked his watch and gave the signal. The timer started now. The timer was running. Now the raiders faced the most dangerous ground on earth. No man's land was a graveyard of mud and rusted iron. In some sectors, the gap between the trenches stretched for hundreds of yards. In others, the enemy was just 30 feet away, close enough to hear them cough, close enough to smell their tobacco. The soldiers moved on their bellies, inch by inch. They crawled through shell craters filled with stagnant water and the remains of men who didn't make it. Patience was the only shield. One mistake meant a rattle of empty tins hung on the barbed wire. These wire tangles were massive, 30 feet wide, 6 feet tall, a forest of iron stakes and jagged steel. Wire-cutting parties often went out nights in advance. They carved narrow paths through the metal to save precious seconds during the actual raid. Suddenly, a soft pop sounded in the sky. A magnesium flare burst overhead. The night vanished. For 15 seconds, no man's land turned into a white, surgical theater under a midday sun. The raiders froze. They became statues in the mud. Movement was death. If a limb shifted, the machine guns would open up instantly. One veteran remembered the rule: keep your head down, close your eyes. Even the glint of light in a human eye could betray a position to a sentry. The magnesium burned, cold and indifferent. Those 15 seconds felt like an hour. The light flickered and died. The darkness returned, heavier than before. The men pushed forward again, their hands sliding over slick mud and cold bone. They were closing in on the German listening posts. A second before killing the sentry, you had to find his ears. Sound was the only map in the black lung of no man's land. Both sides pushed listening posts deep into the mud. Small pits, 2 men, total silence. How do you find a man who is paid to be a shadow? You listen for the scrape of a boot or the drag of a heavy breath. Raiders crept toward these pits on their bellies. One wrong move triggered a magnesium flare. If the light caught you, the entire front line opened up. The goal was simple: reach the pit, find the throat, and silence the alarm forever. But the craters held more than just stationary sentries. Enemy patrols were out there too, moving shadows. Sometimes the night went deathly still. No flares, no pot shots. This silence was a warning. It meant the enemy had their own men crawling through the same wire. In the ruins of a shell hole, 2 groups might collide, 5 meters apart, heartbeats thumping against the mud. What do you do when you stumble upon the enemy in the dark? The instinct is to fire. But a single shot brought down a hurricane of machine gun fire and heavy artillery on everyone. Neither side wanted to die in a random hole for no gain. Nerves frayed. Fingers hovered over triggers. Then, slowly, one group would back away. The other would do the same. They followed an unwritten rule of the wasteland. 2 patrols melted back into the darkness, choosing life over a mutual death sentence. Surviving the hand-to-hand slaughter of the trench was only the first half of the ordeal. Once the grenades went off and the dugouts were cleared, the clock started. Every second spent in the enemy soil was a second for reinforcements to arrive. The return was a frantic crawl. Raiders dragged wounded comrades and unwilling prisoners through a landscape of craters and wire. Machine guns swept the dark. Artillery turned the ground into a furnace. In this chaos, many lost their bearings entirely. Some jumped into a trench with a surge of relief, only to find themselves back where they started. The enemy was waiting. Was the intelligence gained worth the life of a soldier shot by his own side? Friendly fire was the final, silent predator. Sentries on your own line were nervous. They saw shapes looming over the parapet and pulled the trigger. Password systems existed to prevent this, but they were fragile. A sentry might be relieved. The new man on watch often never received word that a friendly party was out in the mud. The disconnect was total. While men died for a single prisoner or a map, officers sat 30 miles behind the lines. They wanted reports. They ordered looks into the enemy's world with the stroke of a pen. Many raids never appeared in official records. The men simply went out and never came back. Success brought its own curse. A clean raid with few casualties almost guaranteed a bloody retaliation the following night. Homemade clubs gave way to factory-built mechanisms. These were tools designed for the kill in spaces no wider than a coffin. The MP-18 changed the math of the trench. A standard bolt-action rifle managed 15 rounds per minute. The MP-18 spat 400. A German stormtrooper entered a dugout with a 32-round drum magazine. He didn't aim. He erased everything in front of him. Only 3,000 reached the front lines before the armistice. It was enough. The concept was proven, and the submachine gun became the new standard for industrial slaughter. But the Americans brought something more primal. The Winchester Model 1897. The trench sweeper. How could one man clear a 20-yard stretch in 2 seconds? The answer was slam fire. The Winchester lacked a trigger disconnector. A soldier held the trigger squeezed tight. He pumped the slide as fast as his arm could move. The hammer dropped the millisecond the action closed. 6 shells. 12-gauge buckshot. A wall of lead in under 2 seconds. The sound of that pump sliding home became a death sentence. In the narrow, muddy veins of the earth, there was no cover from a spread that wide. The German high command was horrified. The efficiency of the weapon felt like a massacre, not a war. They issued a formal diplomatic protest to Washington. They argued the shotgun caused unnecessary suffering. The hypocrisy was total. The same officers who authorized chlorine gas and liquid fire now spoke of humanitarian norms. Why complain about shotguns when you use mustard gas? The German logic was simple. Efficiency terrified them more than cruelty. Berlin issued a final ultimatum. Any American soldier captured with a Winchester or even a single shotgun shell would be executed on the spot. But even a Winchester M1897 was useless without a new tactic for closing the distance. Violence was becoming a science. Armies stopped relying on bayonet drills and started teaching soldiers how to kill with their bare hands. Training camps turned into dojos. Instructors implemented programs in jiu-jitsu, boxing, and wrestling. Commanders realized that a man who could break a neck in the dark was more valuable than a man who could march in a straight line. Small-scale raids were useful, but they were just pinpricks on a giant body. Both sides needed a way to scale this violence. The Germans moved first. They formed the first official stormtrooper unit. The strategy shifted from mass to intelligence, from the hammer to the scalpel. Previous offensives tried to crush the entire front. Hundreds of kilometers of meat and steel. The stormtroopers ignored the lines. They identified pressure points, weak spots in the armor. They didn't capture every trench. They seeped through the gaps like water. The goal was the rear. Stormtroopers bypassed fortified strongpoints, leaving them for the slower infantry waves. They hunted specific targets, artillery batteries and command posts. Isolation was the weapon. Without orders from headquarters, the front line went deaf. Without shells from the supply depots, the guns went silent. The entire system collapsed from within. To execute this strategy, a specific type of man was required. Men with nothing to lose. The stormtrooper was a new breed of elite. No heavy packs, no long rifles, only what was needed for the kill. A soldier swapped his rucksack for 2 canvas satchels. Inside, nothing but grenades. Who would volunteer for this? The selection was brutal. Commanders ignored rank. They looked for athletes, men under the age of 25. They needed lungs that could handle the gas and legs that could sprint through the mud of no man's land. These were the strongest sons of a fading generation. They were given the best tools first. While the regular infantry carried bolt-action Mausers, the stormtrooper received the MP-18 submachine gun. For backup, a Luger pistol with a 32-round drum magazine and a wooden shoulder stock. They carried the MG-08/15, a light machine gun that still weighed nearly 40 pounds. They hauled it into the smoke. If the bullets failed, they used the steel. Trench clubs, maces, sharpened spades. In the south, the Italians created their own version, the Arditi, the daring ones. They didn't just use weapons, they used fear. Imagine the scene, a trench line at dawn. Black-shirted men emerge from the fog. An Arditi soldier sprints forward with a grenade in each hand. Between his teeth, he grips a long steel dagger. He doesn't wait for a whistle. He doesn't wait for a barrage. He moves. Who would voluntarily charge a machine gun with nothing but a knife? The Arditi made it their profession. But the Italians kept these units separate, treating them like a cult of suicide. The Germans did the opposite. They turned the assault into a science. Junior officers stopped waiting for orders. They led by personal judgment. They chose the path of least resistance. They bypassed the strong points. They cut the nerves of the enemy army. The price for this brilliance was the blood of the youth. The casualty rates were astronomical. Entire squads vanished in the gray light. 100 men would go over the top. 5 minutes later, the craters were full. 95% of the raiding party never returned. These 20-year-old men proved their worth in the mountains of Caporetto. October 1917. The Italian front collapsed in a matter of days. German stormtroopers led the surge. They didn't just fight, they bypassed. One commander stood out, Erwin Rommel. He was 26 years old, a stormtrooper officer with a hunter's instinct. Rommel found hidden paths through the jagged peaks. He led 150 men behind the enemy lines. They struck from the rear. Panic followed. A single action by a handful of specialists netted 1,500 Italian prisoners. By the end of the battle, the toll reached 265,000 captives. The focus shifted. Russia exited the war in March 1918. Berlin moved nearly 50 divisions to the Western Front. For the first time since the start of the conflict, Germany held the numerical advantage. It was a race against time before the Americans arrived. The spring offensive opened with a roar. 1 million shells fired in just 5 hours. The density of fire was unimaginable compared to 1914. Steel rained down. The earth itself seemed to liquefy. On the morning of March 21st, a thick fog swallowed the trenches. Stormtroopers slipped into the mist. They bypassed the British strongpoints. They moved fast. They ignored the flanks. Mobile warfare returned to the Western Front. The Kaiser's elite units punched through the stalemate. They achieved a feat thought impossible in the era of barbed wire. In just 2 weeks, they pushed forward 40 miles. Rommel's tactical genius could not fix the strategic exhaustion of the entire German Empire. The elite stormtroopers moved too fast. They outran their own horse-drawn supply wagons. Behind them lay a lunar landscape of flooded craters and pulverized stone. No road survived the preliminary bombardment. How long can an army survive after losing its best soldiers? The answer arrived in the autumn of 1918. The Stostrup units were the first to die. High Command had stripped regular regiments of every veteran, every athlete, and every marksman to fill these elite ranks. They were the tip of the spear. But the tip snapped. These men suffered disproportionately heavy casualties that Germany simply could not replace. By the time the offensive stalled, the infantry consisted of exhausted old men and terrified teenagers. The Allied response was a machine-driven tidal wave. 400 tanks crushed the German wire in a single day. It was the largest combined arms operation the world had ever seen. By autumn, over 100,000 German soldiers had surrendered. The empire was hollow. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally stopped. The Great War began as the pinnacle of modern civilization. It featured airplanes, submarines, and wireless telegraphs. Yet technology only served to peel back the skin of culture. The most advanced societies on Earth spent 4 years spiraling into primal savagery. In the end, the industrial age failed to produce a clean victory. The struggle of nations returned to the mud, settled with clubs and sharpened shovels.